Constrained and restricted to the four walls and who is able to access the UN. And we wanted to share an experience at the UN with an audience beyond the walls of the UN. And so today's event will be broadcast live. Using Facebook, we will be on the UN Facebook channel and cross-posting on the UNDRR Facebook channel. We've never done this before. It's an experiment for us to see if there is an audience who wants to watch and also participate. We know that the way forward in reducing risk is harnessing the power of different communities, listen to all voices and giving everyone a chance to contribute to how they think it's best to reduce risk. And this is really why we're experimenting with this format today. Today is World Tsunami Awareness Day, and we have 3 events that we're celebrating today, kicking off with this dialogue. I'm going to start the dialogue formally in about 15 seconds, if that's okay. Please, if you don't mind, keeping very quiet in the room so that we don't disturb what's happening here. We should have mics here, Kiki. Can we quickly get mics, please, for the speakers? We've got them here. Or do we need to use these mics on the table here? Do we need to use the mics on the table? Okay, let's just hold for 5 while we get speaking mics. I think it's going to be too close. You will hear me say this again in my introduction when we start the Facebook Live broadcast, but of course this year is particularly meaningful when we think about tsunami risks because it's the 15th year commemoration of the Indian Ocean tsunami, which struck 14 countries on December 26, 2004. It's a very personal year for me as well because I worked for the Australian government and was one of the first Australians who was then sent to Indonesia, Maldives, Thailand and Sri Lanka in response to the tsunami. And I will never forget the experience and what I saw. And what was particularly encouraging was the way that local communities, who are of course the first responders, responded to the disaster. People joined together in the wake of the biggest wave and wall of water that some people had ever seen in their lives. How are we going on mics? Okay. Today's discussion is going to be some questions from myself as moderator. We will also take questions from the Facebook page, and I'm also happy to take questions from the floor. If you would like to ask a question, if you could please write it down, and one of my team, Brigitte, who's there in the red, if you raise your hand, we'll collect your question and give it to me, and I will ask it on your behalf to the panel. So you are very welcome to participate and ask questions, but please write them down, raise your hand, and Brigitte will collect them. Okay, we can take the microphones from the booth.
Is it working though? Is it working?
It's working, Kiki, we can see you.
Excuse me.
And remember what I said, really put them close to your mouth. I'm going to start, Mammy, because I'm going to ask you the first question. And I'll start with this one. Are we ready? Are we live? We're ready in the booth? Please, have a seat. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Whether you're here with us in this room at UN Headquarters, New York, or joining us on Facebook Live, welcome to today's discussion about all things tsunami. My name is Stephanie, and I work for the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. Today is, of course, World Tsunami Awareness Day. And this year is particularly meaningful and poignant as it's the 15th year commemoration of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, which affected 14 countries and caused the loss of life for more than 230,000 people. An enormous tragedy, and one that we'd never want to see repeated. And that's why today I have a panel of experienced, at all different stages of life, people who know what it is to live with disaster, who know what it is to think of solutions and ideas to reduce disaster risk. And today what we'd like to do is to have a discussion amongst the 8 of us, not that's just problem-focused, but that's really solution-oriented. Let me introduce our panel to you. I have on my left Wataru Kirakoshi, who's joining us from Japan. Thank you. Mami Misatori, who's the Special Representative for the Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction. Hello. Nicolas Morgado Maldonado, who's joining us from Chile. Shizuho Ido, joining us from Japan. Mark MacDonald, right here from the United States of America, from the AARP Foundation. Hinawi Takanawa from Japan, and Alvin Pratt, also from Japan. Thank you for giving us your time and being prepared to share your experiences today. And thank you for being online and joining us. You're very welcome to participate. That is the true value of social media. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, please do so in the comments, and those questions will get passed on to me, and I will address them to the panel during the course of the next hour. I remember very vividly the evening of December 26, 2004. I was sitting with my family in Sydney, Australia, and we were recovering from Christmas. We were doing the usual thing that Australians do the day after Christmas, watching really bad Christmas movies on television. And on this particular evening, the broadcast was interrupted by breaking news, which showed the first horrifying, terrible photos and images of the devastation wrought in the Maldives, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and Thailand, and other countries at the hands of a 30-meter high wave that was traveling at speeds of up to 150 kilometers an hour. And that evening, at the end of 2004, was really a wake-up call for the world. In fact, I think it was probably the first time I had heard the word tsunami, and perhaps for many of us here today, the first time we had heard that word. And there's good reason. Tsunamis, thank goodness, are relatively rare events. But when they do strike, they're the deadliest, costliest of the natural hazards. Think of the 2011 earthquake and tsunami in Japan. It killed hundreds of people, affected the lives of thousands more, and cost more than $230 billion. It remains today the costliest, most expensive disaster in the history of the recorded world. And very sadly, with the current climate crisis, we can only expect more extreme weather events. In fact, in the last 20 years, the number of extreme weather events has more than doubled. Natural hazards are hitting harder, occurring more regularly, and coming faster and stronger. We cannot stop natural hazards, but we can prevent a natural hazard from becoming a disaster. That's our role as the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, and that's the role that we exercise with member states, with communities, with young people, with older people, and we'd like to discuss how we think that's best done. What are the good ideas that exist in our communities that we can harness to reduce tsunami risk and the risk from other disasters? And Mami, if I may, I'd like to ask you the first question. It's your role to travel the world to talk about disaster risk. Why is it so important to reduce risk?
It's so important to reduce risk when we just look at what disasters can do to all of us. Disasters kill people, maim people, leave people without their jobs, livelihood, and the economic loss that disasters are creating is becoming larger and larger. And importantly, disasters really affect the most vulnerable people. We are talking about the people who are living in poverty. We are talking about children and young people, senior citizens, people living with disabilities, and the world. We all have an obligation to reduce risks from disasters so that everyone, and importantly, these vulnerable people, can be not only protected, but also themselves become agents of change. And that's why we go around the world advocating that disaster risk reduction is crucial for all of us, and it's the business of all of us.
Mami, have you ever experienced personally a disaster? Why is this, for you, an agenda that is so important?
Well, naturally, coming from Japan, where is very disaster prone, you told us about 26 December 2004. So on 11 March 2011, I was sitting comfortably in my house in Cambridge, United Kingdom, where I was living with my husband. And we were just going to go to Berlin for a conference. And I remember my husband coming into the room where I was, checking my emails because it was quite early in the morning. And he said, "You have to look at what's happening in Japan right now." And it was already becoming very, very depressingly terrible, what we were seeing. My husband, he's American British. He used to live in one of those villages that was devastated in a place called Yamadamachi, Iwate Prefecture. And we had friends there, and we knew people, and but we got on a plane, we got to Berlin, and then there was more and more coming in about the fatality. I must say that probably having been abroad, I didn't feel it as acutely as those who were living it in Japan, but I still remember that year in July when we visited Yamadamachi. It was flattened. There was nothing, and that's what disasters do.
Thank you, Mami. We have 4 high school students from Japan here today. Sometimes we refer to Japan as a supermarket for disasters. You experience cyclones, typhoons, earthquakes, tsunamis. Have any of you as students ever experienced a disaster? How did it make you feel? What was the first thought that went through your head? What did you do? You can pass the mic.
I experienced a major earthquake last year. I had no electricity for days. So I feel importance of electricity and every day. So we should attention to disaster more.
How did you cope without electricity? What did you do to continue studying, cooking, showering? How did you survive those 4 days?
I studied examination.
And Alvin, what's been your experience living in Japan?
We all experienced the devastating earthquake last year, but I'll talk about earthquake early warning, which is which makes a frightening sound. It is so horrible to hear even the sound like a nightmare, but it warns us, and we are made to move quickly against the sound. And when I heard the sounds in Kyoto, where I was visiting in travel. It was so frightening because I didn't know what the landscape is in that area. So I couldn't expect what disaster will come thereafter. So, but that sound made me very warned about situation. So I think it's a very important warning.
Shizuho, can I ask for your comments too? Living in Japan as a young person, do you have a fear of disasters?
Yes, because we have an earthquake is often occur in Japan, so we have to prepare for it and in our daily life. So yeah.
How do you talk with your family about disasters? Is it a subject you talk about with your parents?
Yes, and also we have to share ideas with friends, and so I think it is important for us to make net community with high school students to share ideas and experience about disasters and prepare for it.
Nicholas, you're joining us today from Chile. Can you tell us a little of your experience living with disaster risk in Chile?
Okay, as you know, Chile is a place where disaster happens like not every day, but almost like one a week, like an earthquake once a week. Well, I do suffer an earthquake when I was 12. That was the biggest earthquake I've ever suffered, and I didn't know what to do because I was like shocked, and that happens every moment an earthquake happens. So I think every time a disaster happens, I get shocked. Yeah.
How does it make you feel? Does it challenge you to want to change this experience?
Of course. I mean, the buildings in our area all drop off, like broke. And of course, I mean, if I'm shocked and my house broke, I could die, you know? And so that's why I want to change my panic attack.
Yes. Wataru, you're joining us from Japan today. Can you tell us a little of your experience living with the threat of earthquakes and tsunamis and strong winds?
I've never experienced tsunamis, but I experienced devastating earthquakes last year. And I live in Sapporo in Hokkaido Prefecture. It's far from epicenter earthquake, but the close some areas in Sapporo liquefied, and some houses in sink. And people, even now, some people can't live in their house and live in evacuation place. So we need to think disasters as ourselves thinks.
It's true that everyone is affected by disaster, and some people are affected more than others. The most vulnerable in our societies, as Mami referred to earlier, young people, older people. Mark, you're joining us from AARP Foundation today, and your mission statement is to empower people to choose how they live as they age. You're our voice of older wisdom on the panel today. I must say you're holding your age quite well.
Trying. Good, clean living.
Wonderful to hear. Have you ever experienced a disaster?
Sure. You know, I think for myself in Hurricane Sandy in particular, where I live, my parents live, all my relatives lived right where the kind of worst parts hit. And I remember my godmother actually was calling up my cousin saying, there's a whole wave of water coming down. What do I do? And he said, well, get above the basement, like go as high as you can. And her entire, kind of split-level house, the entire first floor was flooded. And it was, a very scary experience to see Mother Nature coming right at you, and you don't feel you have any capacity to fight it. And so it's, what do I do now, and how do I try to be safe?
We know that the world's population is aging, and it's aging very quickly. The number of adults aged 60 or above globally is expected to reach more than 2 billion by the year 2050. And in the US alone, by 2035, people aged 65 and over will outnumber children. What does this change when you're thinking about how to reduce risk for a population which is growing rapidly?
Right. I think, right now, the way we tend to approach disaster preparedness is kind of a one-size-fits-all. And when you think about the intergenerational approach, not just for older adults, but for children as well, how do you start to think about individualizing or being more intentional to create culturally relevant programs, culturally relevant frameworks, and different plans in place so that you can actually get the people who need the help the most safely evacuated or have them prepared, or more importantly, when they are facing challenging situations, how can you create an environment, I hate to say we're comfort, but at least more comfortable than my godmother happened, where I don't know what to do. So I think there's, again, an opportunity to really be very diligent on that work and think through, again, older adults in terms of whether they're maybe isolated, again, most vulnerable, whether they are lacking those social connections that are so critical to really survive these horrible events.
Wataru, you mentioned earlier that one of the after effects of disasters is that people don't have somewhere to go or somewhere to live, and it can take a long time to rebuild. Have you seen the impact that that has had on older people in your community?
No.
When you think about the older people who live in your area and measures or things that could be done to help them prepare for a disaster and recover after a disaster, are there any ideas that are in your head about how to make that decision-making process easier? When you think about how to make it easier for older people to respond to the threat of a disaster, do you have any ideas about what could work? Or anyone else on the panel, you're very free to indicate if you'd like to make a comment.
I think the young people, like their sons or daughters, people have to help older people. And older people needs to families' helps or neighbors' help. Important thing, I think.
Yes, exactly. I think, Alvin, would you like to comment? If we can pass the microphone down. We've just had a question come in from Facebook, which I'll get to in a moment.
I hear that many times old people tends to evacuate lately after the disaster struck. But so we have to issue a warning earlier or make the level of the issue higher or to prompt such old people more early than the disaster will strike. So that is important, I think.
And of course, we have a whole terminology and area of activity around this idea called early warning systems and early action systems. And there is a philosophy that we must leave no one behind. we know that even when early warning systems exist, some people ignore them. And one of the questions that's just been asked on Facebook is very relevant to this part of our discussion. The question is, what can be done to overcome people's natural reluctance to leave their homes when tsunamis are so rare? Mark, I might throw that question to you.
Yeah, I think there's kind of two pieces to this. The first piece is, how do you understand why they're afraid to leave? In most cases, it's they're unfamiliar with their life outside of their home. So when you're thinking about intentionally designing preparedness activities, evacuation plans, it's more than just saying, you go here. It's actually taking the older adults to the place where they're going to be evacuated, familiarizing them with the location so there's a certain comfort level. The other piece is around social connection. There was a study about why were some communities more resilient after natural disasters than others. And the key factor wasn't necessarily the preparation, though I'm sure that's very important. The key factor was community resilience and the connections they had among each other. So that's the other piece. How do you make sure you start to create and establish formal communication, formal social connection with your neighbors, with your community, so that you can really, again, ensure that even those that might be isolated or might be afraid to leave have a person they can rely on.
Have you seen personally, does AARP Foundation help this happen? Have you seen some success in this area that you can describe for us?
Yeah, you know, as we kind of look at, this one's in the fires, but for the Paradise City fires in California, you know, a lot of our work was trying to understand, how do you rebuild a city? So we've been working with the AARP California State Office and some funding as well to think through what are those elements of social connection that is starting to create a certain degree of resiliency and building. There's some technology in place, which is important, that can provide that. But for us, you know, one of the other programs that we do is called Good Neighbor Day. And that's on September 28th, which in the United States is National Disaster Preparedness Month. So how do we make sure that we're connecting with our neighbors and being very proactive in reaching out and understanding who the most vulnerable are? And the last piece that we're trying to really support is, how do you start to create these kind of what we call list of vulnerable people, so older adults, those with disabilities, and then how, when you get those lists together, start to intentionally create communication, community activities as well, that may not necessarily be purely around disaster preparedness, but you can have that thread throughout those different engagements.
Thank you, Mark. Can we have volume back to mics? Mami, I wanted to ask you, Japan has really invested as a country in making sure that whilst it can't prevent natural hazards or extreme weather events from occurring, it can make sure that risk impact is reduced. But is it actually realistic to stop tsunami risk? How does one stop a 200-kilometer-an-hour wave?
Well, realistically speaking, when the tsunami comes, it's going to come, and you can't stop it. But exactly the notion of disaster risk reduction is, how can we make ourselves more resilient when they come? I wanted to pick up on what Mark was saying. The social connection aspect is so important. When I was talking with some people living with disabilities who experienced the March 11 tsunami, they told me, right, we learned a very big lesson. They said they were being prepared for this, so they had a network among themselves, people living with disabilities, and they were going to make sure that they would help each other. However, when electricity went and where there was no way of communicating, they said they couldn't help themselves. So they said, okay, what we really need to do is making ourselves more visible in the society so that people who do not live with disability know exactly where we are and what we need to do. And that's, I think what Mark was saying. Now, here I'm almost thinking social connection is what we're losing a lot these days, whether you're living in a developed countries or developing countries. And you talked about opportunities coming from disaster. Disasters are terrible, but they can unite people when you're going to be prepared, being united with your neighbors in your community, in your own family. This is a powerful tool of making people united. But answering your question, I will also talk about another physical aspect as well, because it is also very important not to build where you know that hazards are going to come. Now, many times we know it, but it's not duly respected. The other thing is, even when you build where you should be building, build to last. That's important. You might think that you are paying more for resilience, but listen, when these disasters happen, that's the time when you know that the extra dollar that you paid in for resilience is going to save your house and your livelihood. A friend of mine who lives here, who's a constructor, told me that too many people here pay attention and how lovely their kitchen will look like. Which is important, right? You want a nice kitchen, but instead of making your kitchen super pretty, put some more money into the structure of your house, and that is going to save not only your life, but your livelihood.
Thank you, Mami. To the students who have joined us today, in September this year, you all participated in the High School Students Summit for World Tsunami Awareness Day in Hokkaido, Japan. We've seen over the last year an extraordinary movement grow amongst young people all around the world. Fridays for Future. Young people who, of course, will inherit the planet that we have largely created and stretched and pushed beyond its boundaries, are now mobilizing around the world to say, we will not allow this any longer. Our future is at risk. And it's not at risk in 30, 40, 50 years. It's at risk within the next 10 years. Nicholas, can I ask you to share with us why participating in the High School Students Summit and being part of a global movement to change things is so important? What have you learned?
Okay, for me, it's so important because when I was 12, I lived an earthquake. I suffered an earthquake, and I saw how every people were like frightened and don't know what to do. And I thought that day we need to do something here because we've lost many people on that earthquake. There wasn't a tsunami, but the earthquake was so strong. And that's why I feel so important to participate in the summit, because I wanted to change people's minds for any disaster.
Shizuho, you were also at the summit. What did you learn whilst you were attending the summit?
Yeah, Earth disaster is not occurring in specific area, but also it may occur around the world. So it is very important to cooperate with people from different countries. So this summit was a great opportunity to have great relationship with young people around the world.
And I think you have some items there that you'd like to share with us. These will be more visible to the people in the room rather than on Facebook. But I think you have some roof tiles there.
Yeah.
Could you tell us about those?
Yes, we.
Nicholas, can you help her?
We learned that it is very important to take action from high school students. So we established an organization called Blossom, which work on disaster prevention in Hokkaido. So, and last week we made a temporary roof tile with cardboard wrapped with tarp, and send this to the area which typhoon hit. Yeah.
Rebuilding and after a disaster, and in fact investing in building before disaster is something that we call risk-proofing investment. And at UNDRRR, we work to implement a global policy framework or a global policy blueprint called the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. It has 7 global targets. It is not a mystery about how we should reduce risk. We know what to do. And member states signed up in Sendai in 2015. They committed to acting in the interests of their publics to reduce risk on behalf of everyone in the countries that they care for. Despite that, convincing people to invest upfront, Mami, as you said, to build to last, to invest upfront in resilient infrastructure is very difficult. And this question has just been asked from the floor here today. How do we convince people that investing before a disaster happens is just as important, if not more important, than investing post-disaster? Mami, I might go to you firstly and then come to you, Mark.
Well, first of all, because it's so difficult to convince, here is the important role of the regulators and the policymakers. So, for example, in Japan and in many other countries where they are disaster prone, there are legal building codes which one needs to respect, and that goes for every company that is in the construction business. This is very important because, as you said, Stephanie, it's not always enough to try to convince. You have to make it a legal requirement, and importantly, it has to be implemented. And if you find people who are not respecting this, they need to be punished. And I think this is very important to build resilience. But at the same time, advocacy is very important, that we advocate for this. And I was talking about America, but we also need to think about developing countries where people really do not have the means to put resilience necessarily. So what needs to be happening? The international community, including donor countries, international financial institutions, multi-development organizations, they also need to figure in resilience when they fund projects, importantly of housing, of critical infrastructure such as schools, hospitals, where, again, the vulnerable people are. So I would say that immediately comes to my mind those two things.
Mark, while Mami passes the microphone, we know that by 2040, we will need to invest $90 trillion in infrastructure to respond to the world's growing population, the growing urbanization of how we live our lives. When you think from the perspective of older people about the importance of infrastructure and investing wisely, are you seeing successful examples of this?
Yeah, you know, when Hurricane Harvey hit Houston and flooded just huge swaths of Houston, and again, the most vulnerable populations are those typically living in floodplains, and the community fundraising to then rebuild is really challenging. We worked with an organization, Rebuilding Together Houston, to focus not just on rebuilding, but actually rebuilding with universal design in place, with the ability to think about it from two aspects. One is, how do you withstand the next flood, hurricane, whatever disaster it might be, but also then, how do you build with aging in place as part of your requirements? The other piece that's really challenging to pull this all off is then, how do you tie the funding mechanisms? Obviously, philanthropy can support that, but inevitably there needs to be some degree of tax-based or government funding to tie to that. And the challenge we had this isn't just with Harvey and Houston, but other rebuilding, is that most funding, either through insurance, through the government, through FEMA, focuses on, let's get something up so people can live, not necessarily let's get something up so they can live as long as they need to in that particular house. So policy regulations are very, very important, but then how do you tie the funding components to those different new regulations?
Hinoe and Alvin, when you attended the high school student summit, I'm sure it was a time of great energy and swapping ideas. Did you discuss this very important question about how you as young people relate to your governments and how you help governments change decisions or make right decisions to protect your future?
Many people say younger people are vulnerable, but actually we are also a strong people in disaster prevention. For example, I considered disaster prevention, which is appealed by the governments or the ministers and bureaucrats, or disaster prevention, which is appealed by young people. Considering this question, young people's appeals sometimes is more persuasive to every people and can leave something in people's minds more. Yes, so we need to stand up and say something for our appeals, and this is what can make a difference. And the young people needs to have to take an action, and the bottom-up action is important. Not only that is from the top down, from the governments, we need to act from its reason, and this kind of the concentration of bottom-up actions can make the nation stronger and more durable to disasters, I think.
Thank you, Alvin. Hinoe, would you also like to answer that question?
Young generation will build a safe future, and we will need experts. So in my school, some students study disasters connect tourism. For example, we should make and improve natural disaster icons or signs indicating where to evacuate for international tourists.
Yes, of course. That's another new consideration, isn't it? Because we today are citizens of the world, And we saw the impact in 2004 on many tourists, people who were holidaying in Thailand or Indonesia or Sri Lanka, Maldives, who had their lives taken away while they were on holidays. So thinking about mobility and the way that people move in the world is a really critical component of planning. Nicholas, you must have seen this in Chile as well. You've spoken about your experience as a 12-year-old. I think you experienced the strongest earthquake that the world has ever experienced. I remember seeing your film that you made on this, where you talk about that experience. In Chile, do you, as students, also interact with your government to help them to think about protecting and creating a sustainable future for you?
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you repeat, please? I didn't understand the question.
How do you in Chile as students interact with the government, or are there opportunities to interact with the government to help them think about your future?
With the government, we do once at semester, I don't know how to say it, but we gather all the school, the security brigade of every school, and we do like our thoughts and how can we improve the awareness of tsunamis and earthquakes, because we are a long country. We can gather all cities together, so that's why we do like region by region. Yeah, that's like we do every year.
And have you seen anything change in what your government has done, plans that it has made, new investments or funding that it has provided towards reducing risk?
Most of the time, the government uses the social media to like spread the voice, but we think it's not enough because people had the wrong information. So that's why we want do something.
It's very important, as you said, that people have access to the right information at the right time, and they know what to do because they've heard and received that information. Wataru, are you doing anything in your school to improve information for other students to reduce disaster risk? Did you or have you discussed in your school, or perhaps at the high school student summit, how you can improve information for other students?
I have never discussed with my school student, but I want to.
How do you use social media as a person, and how important is social media in the lives of young people to spread information, not just to spread information, but to encourage people to change what they do because they have heard something new?
Social media, like SNS, we high school students, we can connect all over the world and quickly. And some disaster happen. Some people, what they want to help. Like, I need water or food, and we know and help it immediately. It is important, and encourage, like.
Mark, technology also plays a role in the lives of older people, but technology doesn't have all the answers. How are you seeing technology be used for solutions, and what are the limits of technology?
Yeah, there's a couple different ways. One is obviously sharing information and really trying to focus on a couple of components. One would be kind of the early warning system, when you can explain when you need to evacuate, what type of steps you need to take to make sure that you're as safe as possible for the older adult. The challenge, I think, with technology in particular is that for very older adults, obviously, There are some limitations in their understanding of the technology. So you need to think, how can technology be a bridge for communication? And that is, I think, something that we at ARP Foundation like to talk about. How do you use technology as a tool to create kind of the direct personal connections that can really resolve some of these issues we've been talking about today in terms of preparedness for older adults in particular.
And Mami, at UNDRR, we see the importance of technology as a way of collecting data. How important is good data to reducing risk?
I would say that data is the foundation of what we do, because first of all, if we don't understand what is the nature of risk we are facing, we can't design a policy. So we need to know what has happened historically, where, how much loss and damage, which is called the loss and damage database. Now, also, we need to have data on exactly who were the victims and what happened. So we know that in times of disasters, women are more vulnerable than men. We know that these vulnerable people that we have been talking about, children, youth, people living with disabilities. But again, here, you need more specific data of how they were really affected. So that's very important. It's not easy to collect these, but if you don't have them, you can't move forward. Talking about technology, now technology is helping us a lot. The drones, the geo movement, we have much better understanding of these damages and loss of disasters because of this new technology. So it's very important. But at the same time, we also advocated a lot that traditional knowledge that comes from indigenous people, that come from the elderly, this is also very important. So we need to, at the same time, use technology as much as possible, but let's not forget about the traditional knowledge that has been guiding principles for so many years and decades.
Speaking of technology, thank you to everyone who's joining us on Facebook. You're very welcome to pose questions, and we will address them. I have an interesting question here from someone who's writing to us from Peru, who asks a very practical question. How much distance should I travel to properly evacuate during a tsunami? And what would be the correct way to evacuate children with disabilities, since my school is less than 100 meters from the Pacific Ocean? I think for me this highlights a very real and present danger. We live in a world with rapidly aging infrastructure, with rapidly changing coastlines, with rapidly rising sea levels, and places that were once safe are now either no longer safe now or in a very short period of time will not be safe anymore. And as Mami mentioned earlier, ensuring that we as UNDRR support governments to have correct policy understanding and to make the correct investments in building where it is safe is very important. I'm going to say that I cannot actually answer your question accurately today because I'm not there with you and I don't know your circumstances. This is one of the points that we just made. Not just access to any information, but access to the right information is correct. So I'm not trying not to answer the question. I want to say that we will come back to you as UNDRR with advice from our office in America and the Caribbean, which is located in Panama, and we'll make sure that we get in touch. We know we have your details on Facebook to answer that question. But you ask a very important question for us. It's actually one of the goals of the Sendai framework. It's called Target D, and it's about building critical infrastructure, public schools, hospitals, roads, ensuring that power and energy is safeguarded. So thank you for your question, and please be assured we will be in touch with you after the session today to answer it correctly. If I can come back to the panel here. As individuals, we've heard that none of us is safe from risk. And each of us has different skills, interests, hobbies, things that we like doing that we could use to help others or to help ourselves in the event of a disaster. Alvin, we had a quick discussion before this morning because I understand you're very interested in fossils. And fossils tell us about the way that the world was. Do they have lessons to teach us about the future of the world? When you think about your future, how do you think you could best use your time helping to reduce risk for other people?
It is quite difficult to connect the paleontology and disaster reduction. But as you said, paleontology is to decode the mystery of nature and the past incidents. So it can somehow help the future. I have no examples, but like a mass extinction, there was, like in the Cretaceous, late Cretaceous, asteroid hits the Earth, and there might be a huge tsunami, and it did devastating damage and wreak havoc on the Earth, and it is inevitable, and all creatures died out. But from this, what we can learn is that sometimes many times nature overwhelms human power, so we need to evacuate as far as possible where we are safe. Could I connect paleontology with disasters? Sorry.
It's a thought for the future, isn't it?
For the future. Yes, in the future, there will be an unprecedented and unexpected nature someday, maybe. And it is with the old measures, the word unprecedented and unexpected will happen. So we need to have measures, but I think we need to also remove them and not expect, but to have the ability to cope with each circumstances and to adapt to each situation, to have the basically ability to manage to make our life safe. So, thank you.
Thank you. It was a tough question. We're going to conclude the discussion shortly, but before we do, Nicholas, I think from memory you're quite passionate about art, and I know that you made an extraordinary film in order to be able to participate in the high school student summit. How do you as an individual think about using your gifts, skills and talents to reduce risk?
Okay, I think dancing and this are so different. But well, you know, I like dancing. This is like my hobby and the thing I do almost every day. And well, to connect this with this, it's so hard. Well, being in touch with arts and awareness for tsunamis.
Yes, we can see many different ways of raising awareness in the world, and perhaps sitting in the walls within the UN is not the best way to raise awareness. I think we have to use many different techniques that meet people where they best hear information, and art and theatre and dance are different ways of telling stories, and we know that through stories people learn. Mark, when you're when you're working together with groups of older people, are you seeing innovative ways to do with the creative industry that are being used to communicate information or reduce risk?
Sure, yeah. You know, for us, when we're thinking about it from the social isolation standpoint, how do you start to build that trust, build that community through the arts? And if you can increase community resilience, that can then, in turn, really help with regards to being able to withstand disaster or prepare more effectively. And so, you know, we've been working with an organization that's been focused on thinking through what are the different types of arts forms that can allow someone to tell them their story, allow them to build that community of trust. And the great thing about utilizing art, in particular with the program that we're working with, is that arts really can be utilized across cultures, across ages. There isn't anything that you need to customize to say, okay, I need to customize this program specifically because I'm working with a high school student or I'm working with a senior. You can let them express themselves through the arts, and it's a very cost-effective and engaging way to tell stories, to create the connection, and then to utilize that as a way to go into kind of other information sharing.
Before we close, I'd like to actually involve the wider room here. For those people who are watching on Facebook, I understand we have around 200 people looking at the moment. We have another probably 50 or 60 in the room with us here today, including 15 students who have traveled from Indonesia. You do have mics in front of you. For our Facebook audience, I will repeat the question if you can't hear it. But if there's someone who would like from the audience to direct a question to someone in the panel, you're very welcome to do so. Are there any questions? Just raise your hand so I can see you. Down the end on the right. You have a microphone in front of you, and there must be a pretty obvious button that you can push to turn it on. Kiki, perhaps? Okay, the green light's, the red light's on. Yeah. If you could ask your question very clearly, speak directly in the mic. Thank you.
Hello, guys, and thank you. And it's not working. Okay, thank you. It's not working.
Continue asking. That's fine. I can hear, and I'll repeat the question.
Okay, if you can't hear me, just I'll yell. I have no problem with that.
Yes, please yell. That's fine.
Hello, my name is Asila. I'm the Omani youth delegate. My country has also faced a lot of typhoons, especially in this time period, more than before, I think, due to global warming. And with us, technology plays a very important role with early warnings and everything. But then you have a negative aspect, which is people sharing fake information, and then people panicking more once they read those. So from your varied experience, what do you think is the best solution for this?
Asida, thank you for your question. I'm going to repeat that for our Facebook audience. Asida is joining us from Oman as part of the Omani youth delegation, and she asked that technology plays a very important part in the role of people's lives and reducing risk in Oman. But she acknowledged that with the ability to communicate, there's also the ability for people to spread false information and the wrong information very quickly. In fact, there is a very famous example of this occurring in Croatia a couple of years ago. On a popular social media platform, there were severe fires occurring in a part of Croatia, and someone intending to do the very best and to enlist more help put a Facebook message out and said, please come and help us fight the fires, and people responded. But they were not able to respond properly, and actually more people lost their lives because people came into the area. So you're absolutely correct. Right information, right technology, right instructions. Would anyone on the panel care to make a comment on the question from Asida? Thank you.
So I think here the role of the government is very important. There are quite a few governments who have designed messaging when these disasters happen, and many times in multiple languages where not one or two languages is spoken, and they have an official communication method that will reach people's smartphones very quickly. So, the government has a very important obligation here, but B, on the part of the receiving end, you should also make sure that you are paying attention to the right information. And if it's just from your friend or a social media, just don't jump on it. You know, human nature makes us feel that you want to jump and react to the first information coming. But no, you have also need to be able to understand which is the correct information. So I think it comes from both the end of giving the information, but also the people who are receiving the information.
I think, too, we shouldn't ignore traditional media options like radio and television. And we at UNDRR work very closely with the World Broadcasting Union, which represents 1,000 public broadcasting unions. They are television and radio channels and stations which are mandated by their governments to serve the interests of people, both through programming and information. So we work very closely with ABU, the Asian Broadcasting Union, with our partners in Japan to make sure that the right information is available on more traditional media options as well. Are there other questions from the floor? If you can raise your hand very high, sorry, on my stool. I'm going to go to the gentleman here on my left. If you can say who you are, please.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, good day. My name is Julian LeBlanc. I am the delegate from the Commonwealth of Dominica Mission. And I'm very pleased to be here today to participate in this discussion. I have a question in relation to traditional and cultural norm. I think it was alluded to this. I was told in Chile that many casualties were not experienced, especially in Concepcion, due to the fact that the people followed some traditional and cultural lifestyle. It is said that many of the people moved uphill when they were told because of animal activities. My question is, how much do our young people incorporate traditional and cultural lifestyle into the conversations that they are having in disaster risk reduction? And also, and as I said, I alluded to that, I heard this in Chile. I want to find out what it is also available in the Japanese culture about following traditional lifestyle.
Thank you, sir, for your question. So the question, just to repeat for our Facebook audience, is what role does traditional and indigenous knowledge play in the work that you do in your communities? Are there instructions that your grandparents or that you have absorbed that you know makes sense to follow in a disaster? Alvin, I'll pass the microphone to you. Thank you.
I heard a story in the 2011, March 11, when the tsunami hits the Tohoku area. There was also in the past, there was a huge tsunami. And there was a monument that the tsunami came till here, and people may not construct buildings under here, but people neglected it and started to build houses and something and more lower places than that monument. And as a result, the huge tsunami came and struck and wreaked havoc on that area. So we must not neglect such anecdotes or past incidents and must learn from it.
I agree, and that's an excellent example. Thank you for sharing. Would anyone else on the panel like to make a comment? Nicholas, have you encountered or have you seen any examples of indigenous knowledge, local knowledge that has existed for a long time, being used to help people reduce risk from disaster?
I didn't understand the question, I'm sorry.
Can you think of any examples from Chile or in your experience where local knowledge, old knowledge, has been used to help people make decisions about responding or preparing for a disaster?
No, I'm sorry.
I think it's a really interesting area, and one that probably hasn't been explored as much as it should. And I thank you, sir, for raising that important question. Would anyone else like to ask a question? Yes, please introduce yourself into the mic. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Stephanie, and to the panel. My name is Frances Zeineden, representing the International Federation on Aging. I'm really pleased with that question from the Dominican Republic delegate on this issue of indigenous persons and traditional information. It was similar to what I was going to ask, and it's very clear that technology obviously has a huge role to play, but we must not forget the traditional knowledge. I hear wonderful stories. I think in many of the islands in the Pacific, one of the stories I've heard, and I'm sure there must be millions of them in Indonesia, because Indonesia has an earthquake practically every day, that the appearance of a specific bird, for instance, can be a warning signal for something that's going to happen. And I think a lot of the older persons, the elders of indigenous tribes, do have amazing knowledge about impending natural disasters, and it should not be forgotten. And I think it's very important to include that traditional knowledge into whatever we plan or strategize for the future. Thank you.
Frances, thank you. For our Facebook audience, Frances was just commenting again and reinforcing the fact that linking Indigenous knowledge and the stories that are told to actions that we can take today is very, very important. And looking at our young panel members here, perhaps this is a challenge for the next High School Student Summit, to consider how you do better connect with ancient wisdom, with Indigenous stories, and use the knowledge that has been absorbed and built upon to feed into planning for the future. Perhaps we as UNDRR can lay down that challenge for the next High School Student Summit. I know we have the convener of the summit in the room with us, so sir, we can perhaps talk about this afterwards. Is there a question? I'm particularly looking at our Indonesian students who are in the room. If you would like to go ahead, thank you.
All right. Okay, I am Aina Khairunisa. I'm currently a law student in Syah Kuala University, Indonesia. So I was a victim of tsunami in Aceh, Indonesia, back then in 2004. And we currently have Tsunami and Disaster Mitigation Research Center, or TDMRC, in Syah Kuala University to promote awareness of tsunami in Aceh. So what I concern the most is how to make the promotion inclusive to people from all backgrounds, especially who are marginalized and at the higher risk. For instance, people with special needs. So, how is the program or upcoming plan in your community to promote awareness among the marginalized people so that we can compare and also apply it in our community? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. And you relayed your experience of being involved in the tsunami in Banda Aceh. Welcome today. And your question was really around how do we involve the most vulnerable and the most marginalized of our populations in planning to reduce risk. I might let Mami quickly reflect on that.
I think the most important thing is to involve them in the planning of disaster risk reduction. So at the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, we are, the government, both national and local, have to make strategies for disaster risk reduction, which is regulated in the Sendai framework. Now, when they make these strategies, they have to include the people with special needs because only they know what their needs are. I think this is crucial. So you need to have a national platform or a platform in the local city with all these different people so that they themselves can talk about their needs, and that is included in the policy of the authorities. That I think is the basic thing we need to do.
Thank you very much. Are there other questions from the floor? Yes, please.
Thank you for the opportunity for me. I am very pleased to be here. My name is Irsyad Al-Ghifari. I am Indonesia USA Youth Ambassador. My question is, how can Japan survive after the tsunami in 2011? Would you mind to share the heroic story? I mean, like, is there, collective work, society with government or private sector, and how youth can change the economic of Japan after the tsunami? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The question again from the Indonesian delegation is, how did Japan survive the 2011 earthquake and tsunami and the extraordinary disaster that happened as a result of that natural hazard, and how are high school students from Japan working with their communities and the government to reduce risk? I'm looking at one of our Japanese students. Is there someone who would like to answer that question? So how are you working? Perhaps you can reflect on the summit and some of the ideas that came from the summit about how to work with your communities to reduce risk.
Through our high school student summits, we have, as Ms. Ido said before, we have established a volunteer group which is called Blossom, and we have some concepts and the things what we want to do. And I will introduce it. And the first thing is that we want to take actions against disasters and contribute to the society through the actions. And the second is we want to bridge students who want to act while they are standing still. We want to bridge them. The third is that we want to share and provide necessary information for students who want to take actions. And the fourth thing is that we want to hand down these activities and our ambitions to the next generations. These four things are our main goals. And through this, we want to make a sustainable disaster mitigation program.
Thank you, Alvin. Shizuho, Hinoi, Wataru, is there anything you would like to add or any comments you would like to make? It's on, just put it next to your mouth.
I think people regard disaster prevention as difficult, but I think we can prepare for disasters from our small action. So I think by taking actions with young people, we can raise awareness of society, of disasters in society. So I think it is meaningful to take action with high school students in Blossom.
Thank you. Wataru, would you also like to comment? The question from the floor was, what are you doing in Japan as school students to reduce risk, to work with communities, other students, and your government together?
Actually, I work with Arvin and Shizuho and Blossom and showing the knowledge of prevention of disasters and take actions using SNS and spread these actions to the high school students around the globe from Hokkaido Prefecture. Our action is small steps, but all around the world high school students do the same thing. It's gonna be a big connection, and it helps improve our awareness for disasters.
As you pass the mic to Mami, can I just say too, this is the extraordinary thing that's been happening for the last 4 years in Japan with the High School Student Summit. On average, there have been between 300 and 400 students every year who have attended the summit. So that represents an extraordinary number of young people in the world who gather every year to discuss these difficult topics. Not just to discuss, but to make decisions that change things in the future. So if you're not involved with the High School Student Summit, may I encourage you to be involved. The convener of the summit is with us in the room, and we're happy to introduce you afterwards. Mami, would you like to comment?
I was actually going to mention that because these 400 students, after they go back to their countries, they are asked to be ambassadors and talk to another 400 students where they come from. And the other thing is the fact that this summit has been going on every year. It's so important because it's about the memory, not forgetting what happened. Everyone wants to forget about terrible things that has happened. That's human nature, and especially if it's like tsunamis that kill hundreds of thousands of people, you really want to forget, but we should not forget. We cannot forget, and the memory has to be retained and also passed on to the next generation and to your peers. And I think that is something that all the young people here today is doing by actively taking part in these events. So I think that's really important, and the same to the young students who have joined us from Indonesia. The fact that you are dedicating your time and energy to come and take part in these events is exactly what we need, because we need to make a more disaster-proof world, and that can be only done by making disaster risk reduction the business of everyone.
Carla, you've joined us today. Carla is a teacher from Chile who also attended with Nicholas the High School Student Summit. Carla, please comment.
Thank you. Well, as a teacher, for me, it's really important to know what the students, how the students feel about disasters. Since I would say that our biggest fear is that something may happen during school time, right? Mm-hmm. And since students spend most of their time at school, I would like to know if, the students' opinion, if they think that school administrations are doing enough. I mean, in Chile, we have compulsory evacuation drills. Most of the students take it seriously, but I would like to know if students feel safe. I mean, in general, even in Japan, I work in a school with 1,800 students, and when we have to evacuate, it's really a problem. We are not sure. Fortunately, none of the disasters have happened during school time, which is good. But what would happen, and how would they feel for Japanese students and also for Nicholas? How would they feel if this actually happens during school time? Would you feel safe?
Mm. Carla, I think you've asked a very good question, and thank you for it. It's the fear that lives in the heart of teachers and parents about what happens if your child is at school and a disaster strikes. Of course, this is why early warning systems are so important, to allow information and accurate information to get to right people in time to act. But the question that Carla asked the panel today were, as students, do you feel safe in your schools? And do you think that your school is doing enough to protect you from a potential disaster?
actually, and we have went through many times of evacuation drills, which are compulsory, but I think it's not enough. Actually, to say the present situation, students belittle the meaning of evacuation drills, like saying it's not on the test, it's boring, it's no use. That's a problem. We need to elaborate the way how we address to evacuation drills or how we operate such compulsory things. In Japan, the evacuation drills are taught to students when we will have an evacuation drill and how and what's the purpose. But this is not a surprise for us. We know, so we have a relief, even if the siren is ringing. So I suggest that these evacuation drills should be not taught to students in advance, and thus students can be more involved in such evacuation drills.
So, Alvin, surprise is very important.
Yes, we need to haste or have a threat in our minds when evacuation drills.
It's very true. Hinoe, would you like to comment? Do you feel safe at school? Do you think your school is doing enough?
My school students actually participate in evacuate drills.
So you feel that you know what to do if something happens. You know where to go to. You know what the teachers should tell you. So you feel safe.
Yes.
At school. Thank you. Shizuho, would you like to comment, or Nicholas?
Yeah, we have evacuation drills at school, but we don't have any other opportunity to learn about disasters. So I think we should have lectures from experts about disasters more.
Information is critical to making the right decisions. Mark, in your experience, looking from the perspective of a US citizen in a government that has the wealth to protect the rights of its citizens, are you seeing information and early warning systems and evacuation practice happening in the communities of people who you serve?
Yeah, and what this kind of builds on a question earlier, what people really rely on are the trusted non-government organization in the community, right? I mean, there's always going to be a certain degree of dependence on the government to provide the necessary information, but for the actual engagement with the community, it's usually the local organizations that are the trusted organizations, whether it's a faith-based organization or other type of kind of community convening leader. So I think it's really important to utilize technology, to utilize traditional media, but to really think through who are the people that the community is going to listen to and can trust to make sure that the right message is going out at the right time with the correct information. So it's on those multiple levels, starting at the top with the government, utilizing traditional media and other technologies, and then actually really getting deep in terms of the community engagement. So it's not easy. I mean, I think that is the key theme here, is that it takes a lot of effort, and it's something that can be done. We know infrastructure is going to be very expensive and very large investment. Kind of sharing information is really more of an investment of time and commitment among the community.
Thank you. We need to wrap up the discussion now. If we can pass the microphone back to Mami. Mami, you've heard the conversation in the room today, and is there a particular challenge you would like to give to us as we go back to normal life, having listened to people's opinions and the interesting ideas that have been discussed today, what would you like us to do?
So there are 3 levels of protecting yourself from disasters, right? One is the public support that comes from governments, either central or local. And then there's the help that comes from your peers, helping each other in your community, in your school. And then there's the last one, helping yourself, making your own self resilient. So I would ask all of you to think about these 3 levels. Think, what can you ask? What do you want to ask your government, whether it's central or local, to do? Look into what's happening, what are the strategies, plans, and think of something that is missing or can be enhanced. That's the first thing. Second thing is, when you go back, whether it's in your family or in your school or in your community with your neighbor, talk about this. There are a lot of people who are not interested or who do not want to know about these things, but challenge them and talk about it, and say that, you know, we're on the same boat together, we need to help each other. And then lastly, think what you can do in order to make yourself resilient. It could be a very different things. It could be yourself becoming an expert studying about disaster risk reduction and joining the United Nations, later working with us. But it could also be any community work that you will be engaged in, helping the vulnerable people in your community. So I would ask you to please think about these 3 levels and think what you can do to enhance each level of support.
Thank you very much. We're going to wrap up now. I'd like to extend our thanks on behalf of UNDRR to everyone who's joined us today, and perhaps those in the room. Thank you. As we conclude, let's remember that risk is everybody's business. None of us is immune from risk, but everyone can do something about it. Thanks for being with us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.